There is an object sitting in your house right now, maybe in a hallway, maybe in a bathroom, maybe forgotten in a closet, and it has a crack running through it that you have simply learned to look past. You tell yourself it is nothing. You tell yourself glass is glass, and a fracture is just physics, just an accident, just a thing that happens when a house settles or a hand slips. But I want you to sit with something before you dismiss this. In the traditional teaching of the church, in the sober and unromantic language of moral theology, nothing in your home is merely physical. Every object you keep, every threshold you cross, every surface that holds your reflection is either ordered toward God or it is not. And today we are going to talk about the objects that many exorcists, many deliverance priests, and many faithful souls across centuries of Catholic life have treated with real caution, broken mirrors, and cracked glass. Stay with me through this, because by the end you will never walk past a shattered mirror in your home the same way again. Let us start with something almost nobody thinks about. A mirror is not decoration. A mirror is a threshold. In the ancient and medieval Catholic imagination, glass that reflects was treated the way a doorway is treated, because a mirror does something no other object in your house does. It creates the illusion of a second world, a copy of your room that seems to exist just beyond the surface, close enough to touch and yet utterly untouchable. Theologians and folk devotion alike, long before modern skepticism flattened everything into just an object, understood the mirror as a symbol loaded with meaning, tied to vanity, tied to narcissus and self-obsession, tied to the sin of admiring the self rather than the creator who made the self. And when something symbolically tied to the self, to identity, to the soul's own image, becomes damaged, cracked, fractured, broken, the question the older spiritual writers asked was not, this dangerous, in a superstitious, magical sense. The question was, what does it mean spiritually to keep a distorted image of yourself and your household on permanent display? Now, hold that thought, because we need to go somewhere most people are not willing to go. The traditional Catholic teaching on order. St. Thomas Aquinas spent enormous energy explaining that sin, at its root, is a disorder, a thing out of its proper place, a good twisted from its purpose. A house that is ordered toward holiness has objects that serve their purpose rightly. A mirror is meant to show you truth, a clean and undistorted reflection, so you can see yourself as you actually are, which, believe it or not, is itself a small moral function, but an aid toward honest self-examination. But a broken mirror does not show truth. It shows fragments. It shows a face split into pieces, a room split into disconnected shards, an image of yourself literally torn apart on the wall of your own home. Ask yourself honestly, is a fractured, disordered image of your own face and your own household something you want silently reinforced day after day, every time you walk past it? Here is where the tone needs to shift, because we are not just talking about symbolism anymore. We are talking about something exorcists across the last century have repeatedly flagged in their pastoral experience, and I want to be careful and honest with you here. This is not solemnly defined church dogma the way the Nicene Creed is dogma. This is pastoral wisdom, the accumulated caution of priests who have sat across from tormented souls and traced their oppression back to ordinary household objects nobody thought twice about. And broken glass, especially mirrors, comes up again and again in that pastoral experience for a very specific reason. Demonic forces, according to the consistent testimony of deliverance ministers, exploit disorder. They do not need permission through grand rituals alone. They can gain a foothold through neglect, through the small compromises we make when we let brokenness sit unaddressed in our homes rather than repairing it, blessing it, or discarding it. Think about that phrase for a moment, a foothold through neglect, because this is the part most people skip past in their rush to either mock the idea or panic about it. The teaching is not that a cracked mirror is a magic curse that summons a demon the instant it shatters. The teaching, echoed by many priests trained in the older exorcism tradition, is that a home filled with disorder, decay, and untended brokenness becomes what they call an environment of openness, a house that communicates neglect of the spiritual life. And spirits of darkness are drawn to neglect the way a drawn mold to a wall. You do not need to believe in a dramatic haunting to understand this principle, because it applies just as much to your prayer life, your marriage, your habits of confession. Neglect is an invitation. And a broken mirror, sitting in a hallway for months because nobody got around to replacing it, is neglect made visible, made physical, made a permanent fixture of your home's atmosphere. Now let's go deeper into why mirrors specifically, and not just any broken object, carry this particular weight in the tradition. Crack plates get thrown away. A broken chair gets fixed or discarded without a second thought. But broken mirrors linger in houses for a strange, almost universal reason. People feel a low hum of superstitious dread even touching them, so they avoid dealing with the problem entirely. They shove the mirror in a garage. They prop it against a wall in a spare room. They leave it hanging with a crack down the middle because throwing it away or replacing it feels like more trouble than it is worth. And in doing so, without realizing it, they let an object associated across cultures and centuries with self-image, truth, and threshold crossing sit in a permanently disordered, permanently untouched, permanently ignored state inside their own home. If neglect invites darkness, what object in your house more perfectly represents neglect than the one thing you are too uneasy to even throw away? Let's pause here and let that question breathe, because I want you to actually think of your own home right now. Is there a mirror somewhere with a hairline crack you have been ignoring? A compact mirror in a drawer, shattered since who knows when? A car mirror, a bathroom cabinet mirror, a decorative mirror inherited from a relative, sitting there fractured and untouched. If your mind just went to a specific object in your house, do not brush that thought aside. Sit with it. We will come back to what to actually do about it before this is over. Traditional Catholic household piety, the kind of piety that shaped homes for centuries before modern secular convenience replaced it, took the ordering of the physical home enormously seriously. Holy water at the door, blessed salt in the corners, crucifixes over the beds, icons and images oriented toward prayer. This was not decoration for its own sake. It was the deliberate ordering of physical space to reflect spiritual reality, because the home in this older vision was never merely a shelter. It was a domestic church, a small sanctuary, and everything inside either supported that sanctuary or worked against it. A broken mirror, left unaddressed in a domestic church, is a crack in the sanctuary wall. Would you leave a crack running through a stained glass window in a chapel and simply walk past it every day, telling yourself it was fine? Then why do we do exactly that in the small chapel of our own homes? Now, I want to bring in something that deliverance priests describe with remarkable consistency, and it has to do with what they call attachment or residue. This is not a claim that every broken mirror harbors a demon. Let me say that plainly so we do not slide into superstition for its own sake. But many priests trained in the discernment of spirits describe a principle where objects can become associated through repeated exposure to strong negative emotion, anger, despair, violence, occult practice, or even the sheer accumulated weight of years of unaddressed disorder with an atmosphere that is spiritually heavy. Ask any exorcist and then they will tell you the physical objects in a home matter. That is precisely why house blessings exist, why priests walk room to room with holy water, why the ritual Romanum includes prayers specifically for cleansing dwellings. If physical objects genuinely carried zero spiritual weight, none of that liturgical practice would make any sense at all. The church built an entire rite around blessing physical space because physical space is not neutral. So let's ask the uncomfortable question directly: could a cracked mirror left in your home for years become a small magnet for exactly the kind of low-grade spiritual heaviness that oppresses a household without anyone ever naming why? Many priests in the deliverance ministry would say yes, cautiously, without hysteria, but yes. Not because the glass itself is evil. Glass has no moral agency. But because the disorder it represents, the neglect it embodies, and the symbolic distortion of the self it constantly displays create exactly the kind of small, ignored opening that the tradition consistently warns against. Little foxes spoil the vineyard, Scripture says. It is never the dramatic, obvious evil that undoes a household first. It is the small, tolerated disorder, the crack nobody fixed, the thing everyone got used to. Let's talk now about vanity, because this is where the older spiritual writers get remarkably blunt with us, in a way modern self-help language never would. A mirror's proper use is brief self-examination, checking that you are presentable, and then moving on with your day toward God and neighbor. But how many of us linger at mirrors far longer than that, scrutinizing, judging, either inflating pride or spiraling into self-hatred? The spiritual masters warn that mirrors, even unbroken ones, are occasions of a subtle temptation, excessive self-focus. Now imagine that same temptation toward self-focus, except now the reflection staring back at you is literally shattered, fragmented, distorted. What message does a fractured reflection reinforce in a soul already prone to distorted self-image, especially in the young, especially in anyone already struggling with identity, self-worth, or scrupulosity? A broken mirror does not merely fail to serve its purpose. It actively teaches the eye to see brokenness as normal, as background, as simply how things are. And what the eye learns to accept as normal The soul slowly learns to accept as well. I want you to notice something else, something almost nobody mentions. Cracked glass produces distorted light. It refracts strangely, catches reflections at broken angles, throws fragments of your face or your room back at you from unexpected directions when the light hits just right. Older folk piety, closely tied to Catholic culture across Europe and Latin America for centuries, treated this distorted light with real unease because light itself carries deep theological weight in the Christian imagination. Christ is the light of the world. The soul is meant to be illuminated by grace, not fractured, not scattered, not refracted into broken pieces. A cracked mirror takes ordinary light, the same light theology associates with truth and grace, and physically breaks it in disordered fragments before your eyes every single day without you consciously noticing. Ask yourself, do you want a permanent fixture in your home that takes light and quietly, mechanically, endlessly breaks it? Now let's talk about what happens practically in real pastoral accounts when families finally address these objects. Priests involved in house blessings and minor deliverance work describe a pattern reported again and again by ordinary families, not dramatic Hollywood hauntings. But a persistent low mood, unexplained tension between family members, restless sleep, a sense of heaviness in a particular room, that quietly lifts after the home is blessed and disordered objects, broken glass among them, are finally removed or repaired. Correlation is not proof, and I want to be honest with you rather than sensational. No priest worth listening to will tell you a cracked mirror is guaranteed to cause oppression. But the pattern is consistent enough, reported by enough serious and sober priests across enough decades, that dismissing it outright as pure coincidence starts to feel like its own kind of willful blindness. Let's return to Scripture for a moment, because Scripture itself uses the image of mirrors in a way that should stop us cold. St. Paul writes that now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. St. James compares the man who hears the word but does not act on it to someone who looks in a mirror, sees himself, and immediately forgets what he looked like. The mirror, in the biblical imagination, is already tied to the theme of partial, imperfect, incomplete vision, a vision that will only be made whole in eternity. A cracked mirror takes that already imperfect, already partial image Scripture warns us about and fractures it even further. It is not a neutral household item in the world Scripture describes. It is, whether we like it or not, saturated with symbolic and spiritual meaning that the biblical authors themselves clearly recognized. Here is something practical, something you can act on tonight, not next week, not someday, tonight. If you have identified a broken mirror or cracked glass in your home while listening to this, the traditional counsel is simple and unglamorous. Do not panic, and do not treat this as an emergency exorcism situation, because it almost certainly is not. Instead, treat it as what the tradition calls ordinary spiritual housekeeping. Remove the broken item from the home respectfully. Do not simply toss it in a public dumpster where anyone might handle shattered glass and injure themselves, but dispose of it safely and deliberately, the way you would dispose of anything you are consciously choosing to remove from your domestic church. If the item holds sentimental or family significance and you feel called to repair rather than discard it, have it properly repaired by a professional rather than leaving the crack indefinitely. And in either case, many priests recommend a simple household blessing afterward, using blessed salt and holy water, walking through the room where the object sat, asking God to restore order to that space precisely because disorder was allowed to sit there for however long. I also want to address something honestly because I respect you too much to leave it out. Some people listening to this will feel a temptation toward scrupulosity, toward obsessively hunting through every drawer in the house for the tiniest chip in a mirror, toward treating this teaching as a source of anxiety rather than sober discernment. That is not the goal here. And it is not the spirit of the traditional teaching either. The masters of the spiritual life, the same ones who warn about disordered objects, warn just as strongly, arguably more strongly, against scrupulosity and superstitious anxiety, because that too is a disorder, a fear that has slipped its proper bounds. The goal is not paranoia. The goal is ordinary, sober attentiveness to your home the same way you would give ordinary, sober attentiveness to your prayer life, not obsessive, not paranoid, but not neglectful either. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because broken mirrors are really just one example of a much larger principle that traditional Catholic spirituality insists on and modern life has almost entirely forgotten. Your physical environment is not spiritually neutral. Clutter, disorder, filth, broken things left unaddressed for years, these are not merely aesthetic problems or organizational failures. They are in the traditional vision, small physical echoes of interior disorder. And interior disorder is exactly the soil demonic influence prefers. This is why the saints so often connected physical asceticism, cleanliness, and order with spiritual health. Saint Benedict's rule governs the physical arrangement of the monastery down to where tools are kept, because he understood with remarkable psychological precision centuries before modern psychology existed that physical order and interior order reinforce each other constantly in both directions. So here is the real question underneath everything we have discussed tonight. And I want you to sit with it rather than rushing past it the way you might rush past a cracked mirror in a hallway. What else in your home have you been walking past? Telling yourself it is nothing, telling yourself you will deal with it eventually, telling yourself it is just an object. Because the teaching we have walked through tonight was never really only about glass. It was about the quiet, accumulated permission we give to disorder in our lives, permission we extend one ignored, unaddressed, unrepaired thing at a time until our homes and eventually our souls are filled with small fractures we have simply stopped noticing. Let's go back for a moment to something almost every culture that has ever produced a Christian household has independently arrived at, because that kind of convergence is worth pausing on. Across Mexico, across Poland, across Ireland, across the Philippines, across Italian villages and German towns, you find again and again the same instinct. Mirrors are covered after a death in the house. Mirrors are treated with unusual caution during storms. Mirrors near a sickbed are handled differently than mirrors in an ordinary hallway. Skeptics will tell you this is nothing but folklore, disconnected superstitions with no common root. But ask yourself why so many unrelated Catholic cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, arrived at the same uneasy instinct about reflective glass without ever comparing notes. When that many independent Christian societies converge on the same caution, the tradition does not dismiss it as coincidence. The tradition asks what deeper spiritual instinct might be surfacing through all of them at once. Something older and more universal than any single folk custom, something closer to a genuine sensus fidelium about the nature of thresholds, images, and the self. Consider, too, the specific moment of death in these traditions, because it sharpens everything we have already discussed. Why cover the mirrors when someone dies in the house? The traditional answer offered by generations of the faithful is that the mirror is a threshold, a place where the visible and invisible seem to brush against each other. And in the disordered, vulnerable hours surrounding a death, the household does not want that threshold standing open and undefended. Now transfer that same logic to a broken mirror, sitting cracked and unaddressed for months or years. If an intact mirror is treated with this much deliberate care at moments of spiritual vulnerability, what does it mean that a shattered one, a threshold already fractured, already disordered, already compromised, sits wide open in your home every single day with no covering, no blessing, no attention at all? I want to bring your mind to the confessional for a moment, because there is a parallel here that the old spiritual directors love to draw. When a soul confesses sin, the priest does not merely note that something happened. He asks about pattern, about frequency, about whether the sin has become habitual, because habitual, unaddressed sin behaves differently in the soul than an isolated fall. It calcifies, it becomes structural. It stops being an event and becomes an environment. A broken mirror works precisely the same way in your home. The first day it cracks, it is an event, a minor accident, nothing more. But the longer it sits there unrepaired, unaddressed, unremoved, the more it stops being an accident and starts being a structural feature of your household's spiritual atmosphere. The domestic equivalent of an unconfessed, habitual sin quietly shaping the environment of a soul. This is why the old priests never treated timeliness as optional. Deal with the crack quickly, they would say, the same way you deal with sin quickly, before the isolated event hardens into a permanent fixture. Now let's talk about children, because if you are a parent listening to this next part matters more than almost anything else we have covered. Children absorb the unspoken atmosphere of a home far more than they absorb its explicit lessons. A child does not need to be told a broken mirror is unsettling to feel that it is unsettling. Children register disorder, decay, and neglect on an almost instinctive level, long before they have the words to explain what they are sensing. How many parents have noticed a child who refuses to walk past a certain mirror, who avoids a particular hallway, who seems oddly unsettled in one corner of the house, and simply chalked it up to childhood imagination? The tradition takes a different view. Children closer to innocence and less clouded by adult rationalization of are sometimes the most sensitive members of a household to precisely this kind of spiritual disorder. If your child has ever refused to go near a broken mirror in your house, ask yourself honestly whether you dismiss that discomfort too quickly. And let's not stop at mirrors, because cracked glass more broadly, windows, picture frames, glass tabletops carries a related but slightly different weight in the tradition. A window is meant to let outside light in cleanly. A cracked window distorts that light and, practically speaking, weakens the very boundary between your home and the world outside. The boundary a house blessing is specifically meant to reinforce. A shattered picture frame over a family photo or a religious image compounds the problem further, because now the disorder is not merely physical, it is layered directly onto an image meant to carry meaning, a wedding photo, an image of a grandparent, an icon of a saint, viewed forever afterward through a lattice of cracks. Every time a family member's eye passes over that image, the crack passes with it. The tradition would ask you plainly, is that the message you want silently repeated to your household day after day, year after year? There is one more layer I want to walk you through before we close, and it concerns something the old moral theologians called scandal, not in the modern gossip sense, but in the precise theological sense. The giving of occasion for a fall to another person through your own conduct or your own environment. Consider a guest entering your home, someone perhaps already spiritually fragile, already anxious, already carrying wounds you know nothing about, who happens to catch sight of a shattered mirror in your hallway. You cannot know what that image stirs in a heart you cannot see into. The old spiritual writers took an environmental scandal seriously precisely because they understood that a home is never purely private. It radiates outward onto every soul that enters it, guest, child, spouse, stranger alike. Keeping your household in visible order, then, is never simply about your own sanctity. It is an act of charity toward everyone who crosses your threshold, whether they ever consciously notice the difference or not. Before you go, let this be the one thing you take with you. Walk through your house this week, deliberately, room by room. The way a priest walks through a home he is about to bless. Look for what is broken, what is cracked, what you have quietly stopped seeing because you have gotten used to it. Repair what can be repaired. Discard what needs to be discarded, and ask God honestly and without fear to restore order to every corner of your home, because a domestic church, like any church, deserves to be kept whole. That cracked mirror sitting somewhere in your house right now is not just glass. It is an invitation, and how you respond to it tonight, this week, is entirely up to you.